Welcome to Ask Dr. Change. I'm Dr. Linda Ackerman Anderson. I'm happy to have you join me today to explore how to seriously uplevel your leadership and consulting to transformational changes, all through conscious change leadership. Welcome. Today is part 2 of my overview of the 10 most common mistakes in leading transformation. Today's focus is remedies for these mistakes. If you've considered the occurrence of these mistakes outlined in part 1 of this podcast and determined those that are most costly to your organization's ability to succeed in change, I want to discuss how you could potentially find ways to actually alter the patterns that create them and uplevel your organization's capability to lead change, especially transformational change, more successfully. As you listen today, consider what strategies you can use to inform, plan, and execute stronger approaches to leading your changes, and expand your own repertoire of services to do so. I'm going to cover a lot of material, and so perhaps there is some of this that will be most useful to you. Take notes if you can. So mistake number 1, I'm going to repeat the mistakes to keep them in focus in how we talk about mitigating them. The first mistake is relevance and meaning, not overtly linking the change effort to the market and the organization's business strategy to create clarity in the minds of stakeholders. Again, quick refresh. Relevance is why the change is important in the larger scheme of things, so stakeholders can actually understand the why of doing this beyond their own particular role. Meaning is about their particular role and themselves. It's personal to them. Why the change is of value to them, how they make sense of it individually, how they can find themselves in it. So relevance and meaning. Consider then, to figure out how we might overcome some of these things, consider how you might carry out any of the following. In advance of communicating about the project, support your leaders to clarify specifically the link between the change and their organization's business strategy so they can articulate it in terms their stakeholders can relate to. And that message might be different for different stakeholder groups. But the critical thing here is how to make it relevant and meaningful to the stakeholders and put it in their terms. Another option is to create a communications plan that enables stakeholders themselves to explore, understand, ask questions, make sense of what the change may mean for them personally. A communications plan is typically what we're going to communicate out to the organization and how we're going to do that. This in particular, as I'll talk about later, is an engagement strategy. How to make the communication available to your stakeholders so they can actually make sense of it for themselves, discussing it among their peers in a safe environment. You can also provide follow-up mechanisms, team meetings, discussions, brown bag lunches, for stakeholders to continue to find themselves in the change and what it means to them, especially over time, since their understanding may drift. It might be a way to engage middle managers and line leaders so they can support deepening the understanding of their teams in the value of making this particular change. Provide ways for stakeholders to understand what they need to do and what they can do to support the change and make it successful. They often don't know what their role is until the gadget or the IT or the new way of doing things lands on their desk. So what can they do to actually further ownership of what's being asked of them? Follow up, circle back, keep them informed, engaged over time. Perhaps use trial runs, pilots, or pre-deployment experiences so they can practice before official deployment. All of this will deepen their understanding and their relevance and meaning. Mistake 2, change governance. Unclear change leadership roles, structure, decision-making, and interface with operations. Consider the roles you use today. Are they the right ones to address the full scope and the A to Z process of the project? Are they filled with the right people who have the capability and understanding to actually successfully fulfill them? Are people clear about who does what and who has what authority over determining right actions, decisions, and progress assessment? Set up a clear structure that demonstrates how the roles and teams interact. Align the structure with your normal operating structure so they can work well together. We often call this a parallel structure, one that runs the organization normally and one that runs this major change effort. So many leaders are on both, and they wear two hats, an operating leadership role and a change leadership role, and they meet in separate meetings, not the same meeting, but in separate meetings to fulfill that. And the structure of the change will help enable this to occur. They really have two different roles. Ensure that your decision-making reflects the desired culture your project is championing. This is another major piece. Do you have a decision-making style that matches what you're asking culturally of the organization in the future? So roles, structure, decision-making clarity, and then interface with operations. How are you going to support the predictable pinch points that occur so that you can get out of the woods objectively and neutrally instead of creating political upset? All of this is a part of governance. Get clear about the roles, relationships, and decision authorities. Mistake 3 is the strategic discipline for change. Leaders not providing a strategic discipline for how change is led across the organization. No enterprise change agenda, no common change methodology, and inadequate infrastructure to execute change successfully. The first step here is to establish the necessity of leading change as a strategic discipline. Change is pervasive, essential, and costly if not managed well. And so consider the power of an enterprise change agenda. This is something that senior leaders create, orchestrate, monitor over time. It's getting their arms around all of the significant changes happening in the organization so that they can specifically know they are on top of what they're asking of the organization and its magnitude. An enterprise change agenda ensures 5 critical benefits. Current change efforts are the right ones to execute and fulfill business strategy. So many of the pet projects are taken off the agenda because they take up time, attention, capacity, resources, and they're not essential. So ensuring you have the right priority initiatives on the agenda. Second benefit, efforts are prioritized, organized, assigned, and paced optimally. When you can stand back and see all of the inevitable interactions, then you can rearrange the major change efforts so that they can be organized and managed effectively. Third benefit of an enterprise change agenda, it ensures that the organization has the capacity. We mentioned the importance of capacity. That means stamina and capability to carry out and succeed in the priority changes you're asking of the organization. Fourth benefit, the ability to assess and drive required culture change in every one of the major initiatives you have. Culture is prevalent. And so how can we ensure we're driving it effectively within all of the key changes on the agenda? And fifthly, a change agenda is the best way of coordinating and leveraging all of your external change consultants. I've worked in organizations that have 2, 3, 4 major consulting houses doing very different things around change in the organization. And how do you get the bang for the buck on the expense of external consultants? They're needed. I am one. I'm not a large consulting house, but how do you actually optimize who's doing what for all of the externals that you bring in to support the success of change? So many benefits of an enterprise change agenda process. In addition, I want to ask you how many change approaches are in use in your organization. Remember, part of this is a common change methodology. I'm sure you have project management, change management, OD, Agile, Lean Six Sigma, lots of others. Do they compete? Do they use different terminology, different tools? We use the Change Leaders Roadmap as the one common change process that builds off of all of the benefits of the other project management, change management, OD, etc. It's an essential ingredient to efficiency and capability in leading change. To learn more about the Change Leaders Roadmap, please see our book, The Change Leaders Roadmap, How to Navigate Your Organization's Transformation. An additional part of this is common infrastructures to mitigate confusion and redundancy among various approaches. When the different approaches have different ways of doing things, it's really challenging when to use what throughout the process. So some common infrastructures can be established and managed throughout all changes in the organization. Perhaps standard practices for case for change or developing your change strategy. Standard roles, charters, decision-making processes, meeting logistics. Common conditions for success, common metrics. Templates for change communications, engagement, and information management. And requirements for a multiple project integration strategy and process. You may have other infrastructures as well. This is a good starting list. Any of these make sense to actually establish a common way of doing it in the organization that adds to your ability to make change a strategic discipline. Mistake 4 is misdiagnosing scope. The mistake is misdiagnosing the scope of the project, either in magnitude or by initiating only technological and organizational initiatives and neglecting the cultural, mindset, and behavioral requirements. One of the means we use to determine full scope of the organizational requirements, the human dynamics, and culture, a model we use called the 7 drivers of change. I reviewed this model in an episode on generating full scope, which is episode number 28. You can review that. The drivers help articulate the organizational requirements as well as the cultural, behavioral, and mindset requirements, both for leaders and stakeholders, all required for sustained success. You can also think about scope from your stakeholders' point of view. What do they need to be able to adopt and sustain the solution you are deploying? What training of skills and information, ways of interacting with others, use of IT, cultural norms, all of this is required to have the change stick. All of this requires attention in your plans and must be reflected in a full scope because it requires attention, resources, timing, events, etc. One additional support of developing a full scope is to start by performing an initial impact analysis on your desired outcomes and on potential solutions to address the full range of impacts the project will trigger in the organization, both organizationally and in terms of human dynamics and your stakeholders' reactions. All of this can be put into scope because it will all require attention. Mistake 5, initiative alignment and integration. This is running the project through multiple separate or competing initiatives, rather than aligning all initiatives as one unified effort and ensuring the integration of plans, resources, and pace. Now, some organizations use portfolio management to oversee complex initiatives. That's helpful if it attends to the full scope of project interactions, resource allocations, etc. We need to align multiple initiatives with a common and overarching purpose. We often call this the big win. It unifies them together. It tells a common story, a compelling story as to why you're initiating so many different things to achieve this particular outcome. It absolutely provides relevance to all of the change that's taking place. In terms of integration, we recommend setting up an integration process and structure that enables you to optimize resources, coordinate actions and events, reveal and reduce redundancies, competitions, and collisions, and pace and sequence actions optimally across the initiatives that impact common stakeholders or parts of the organization. We often call our integration process air traffic control. Who gets to take off first and second, and how do we organize the impacts across time? Or ultimately, we are then able to optimize piggybacking, working in parallel, and supporting each other with shared resources if we're able to stand back and see the interactions across multiple changes. Mistake 6, capacity. This is the big one. Not creating adequate capacity for the change, setting unrealistic, crisis-producing timelines, and then laying the change on top of people's already excessive workloads. This, as I mentioned in part 1, is the number one mistake: inadequate capacity for change. Again, over and over and over again, it shows up. We need to find ways to free up people who must work on the change to have the time and focus to do their change work. The same is true for stakeholders who are receiving the changes and have to adopt them. Performing a change capacity review that assesses current operations for what can be taken off the plate, what can be slowed down or paused, all of this can be useful to help generate additional capacity. Can you bring in acting or additional resources to cover important work while the people in change roles can be freed up for a time? There are lots of options for generating additional capacity for change. We just need to be conscious about it. The one overt act of leaders adjusting workloads will bring them huge appreciation in the organization and reduce a great deal of the upset and chaos and pressure they feel because you're asking way too much of them. In terms of timelines, assess realistic timeline only after you have performed a full impact analysis and implementation plan review of your desired solution. That way you can determine the time required to actually fulfill the work required to get it into place, to deploy, adopt, and sustain, and then make your timeline adjusted to the reality of how much it's going to take. Mistake 7. Culture and mindset. This is about not adequately addressing the organization's culture and mindset as major forces directly influencing the success of change. There are two views of culture that need to be understood and reflected in your plans: the culture of the overall organization and the cultural implications within individual projects. Most content experts do not consider the culture in their solutions or plans or mindset for that matter. Culture needs to be addressed during the initial phase of planning for your change. It's an important part of scope and needs attention very early, not later. Here are some actions to help you think and act at the beginning and input to your scope. Consider the cultural norms and attributes your future state requires. What mindsets are needed to produce and sustain it? From leaders? From stakeholders? What already supports change? What about the culture blocks it? And what may need to be created because you've never actually done it before? Assess your prevailing culture and mindset against the desired culture and mindset, and be specific about this so people can truly understand values, norms, behaviors, tangible indicators like how decisions are made, how mistakes are treated, how information is shared, work practices, relationships, behavioral patterns, and underlying human dynamics. There's so much that can be looked at and identified around the culture that supports the success of your project's outcomes. Make plans for overall culture and mindset change directly in your project plan from the beginning and support and fund this work. This is critical additional work, both in scope and also in execution. Further, in terms of mindset, there are 3 mindsets that need to be assessed and planned for: the leaders, the stakeholders, and the project team setting up and executing the change itself. If they are not mentally and emotionally aligned with the desired outcomes and case for change, the project won't succeed. So question, are you in a position to address this deeply personal aspect of your leaders and stakeholders? Is coaching available? Personal development training? In our approach, we offer a powerful training experience for leaders to address this very issue. We call it Leadership Breakthrough, Walking the Talk of Change. In this program, leaders are guided through a personal process to discover their current mindsets and how they may need to alter them in order to support the future they're asking of the organization. We raise their awareness, their consciousness, and their collective support of the organization and what needs to change inside of them and inside of the organization. The process, the leadership breakthrough process, is a very powerful one, often life-changing for people, because it's often the very first time they've looked at what's real in their own mindsets and relationships and teamwork and the ways in which they communicate that will support the change or block it. Mistake 8, leadership modeling. That program that I described, the Leadership Breakthrough, Walking the Talk of Change, is all about supporting leaders to model the change. However, the mistake is leaders not being willing to develop themselves and change their mindsets, behavior, or style to overtly model the changes they're asking of the organization. One of the worst possible things is for leaders to say, go change them and leave me alone. Well, in transformational change, it's essential for leaders to walk the talk of what they're asking of the organization. If there are cultural, behavioral, or mindset requirements at play, which there typically are in transformation, the sponsors and other leaders not only need to understand these requirements of them, but to model them and to go first, to be out in front as models and champions and proponents of these changes. That gives them and the effort greater credibility. So first, in dealing with this, determine how the leaders need to talk, behave, interact, lead differently to support the future state. If you can do this with them and ensure they truly understand the link between their behavior, credibility, and the success of the project, it will go a long way to getting their willingness to undergo this development. Then determine a collective approach to ensure leaders practice specific behaviors and language to demonstrate the changes needed in them and the changes needed in the organization. Ensure they understand what modeling looks like. Maybe use various scenarios for them to see it in action, practice it. Make clear agreements for them to be intentional models and set up follow-up support and reinforcement. This is a process over time for them to live into a new reality of the organization and a new way of leading for them. So do you coach? Do you advise on personal development? Help prepare the leaders to play their part in modeling the change and championing it in word and action. This requires them to trust you, and it's essential to maintain confidentiality to be able to do it effectively. Mistake 9, human dynamics. This is about not adequately and proactively attending to the emotional side of change, not designing actions to minimize negative emotional reactions, and not attending to them in constructive ways once they occur. People will have reactions. It's change. We can't avoid this. However, the challenge is, how do we best support them through their reactions to move them from resistance and confusion to understanding and commitment? Support versus threat is essential in this strategy. Leaders need to know how to do this themselves, and being skilled at this adds a critical dimension to good leadership. It can't be delegated or sidestepped. Facilitate your leaders to consider the implications of making the change they're leading on the stakeholders and leadership and management ranks. Who wins? Who loses? Are they ready to take this on? What new skills and behaviors will be asked of them? How can you best design actions into your initial change strategy to accommodate these needs as you see them? How can you design the change strategy to specifically minimize negative impacts on people? This is a really important upstream requirement of leaders to make their change strategy and process plans specifically in ways that minimize the negative impact on stakeholders. What else might you explore and determine around the human dynamics? You might include people's emotional reactions, relationship dynamics, politics, resistance, stakeholder mindsets. These tangible issues need to be built into your process plan, and competent facilitators are needed and to be engaged and used in a timely way. Consider also the possibility that your stakeholders may need emotional healing from past changes. We have seen this a lot. Emotional upset from past changes will carry on to what you're attempting to do. In our experience, we have trained leaders to do what we call listening circles, to go around the organization, various geographies, to hear from stakeholder groups who have been hurt by the past, allowing them to vent and air what upset them, allowing them to open up about their hurt in a safe environment and non-judgmental environment brings them to a more positive place to engage in the new change work. This is a very powerful and courageous strategy for dealing with the human dynamics and for supporting your stakeholders to actually be able to step into supporting the new change and trust your leaders even more. Last mistake, engagement and communications. How do you get your project stakeholders on board with what's happening and what you're asking of them? How do you generate buy-in? The mistake is not adequately engaging and communicating to stakeholders, especially early in the change process. Relying too heavily on one-way top-down communication and engaging stakeholders only after design is complete. There's a lot in this particular mistake and a lot we can do differently than we have in the past. Here's a good truth to remember in guiding this work. Change happens from the inside out. If we don't account for people's reactions and needs, and we don't engage them in creating their future, we cannot expect them to change, no matter how much pressure we apply. This is an important principle to guide how we're leading our changes, especially transformation. In this mistake, we link communications and engagement because good change communications is engaging people, not just informing them. Again, caution, as I mentioned in part 1, announcing change with death by PowerPoint. That's not what we mean by good change communications. People need to have their communications enable them to think, to discuss and ponder what you're asking of them in the organization. And just asking for questions after a big presentation is not adequate. You can't check the box. Change communications is not the same as corporate communications. Change communications is designed to engage people, to excite and compel them to think and buy in. Corporate communications is designed to inform, typically one message that fits all, that doesn't trigger excitement for making the change. In all change communications, you will likely be tailoring your messages to fit the various types of stakeholders you're impacting. Remember, you want to make the change, the project, relevant and meaningful to them. How best to do that in words and terms they understand. Also know that change communications is a process. It's never one and done. It needs to stay current with what's happening in the project over time. While you may have a communications plan for events over time, much of what is needed during complex change will be emergent. Rumors show up, changes to the plan, and so your change communications people are really important to have on your change leadership team and your project team. They don't necessarily have to be voting members, but they need to be listening carefully for what needs to be communicated and how to engage stakeholders if something unforeseen shows up. By engagement, I really want you to understand it means asking stakeholders to explore the case for change, participate in perhaps a current needs assessment, getting them involved in shaping what needs to happen or what the ideal solution might be. There are many ways to engage stakeholders, many types of engagement, many vehicles, both face-to-face and technological. Get creative. Know that tasks in your project plan, many of them are opportunities for stakeholder engagement early in the process. And remember, the best engagement is task-driven. It's used to access specific value of specific stakeholders about the solution or design requirements or impact assessment. Use it to get your stakeholders involved and invested in the change. Give them a role, ask them questions, ask them to make their best contribution. Once they understand the relevance and meaning of the project, that's the best time to get their best ideas, perhaps within the confines of scope or boundary conditions or design requirements, but still being able to make a contribution to the change will bring them to a sense of feeling that they've contributed and they have some increased ownership of the project itself. They'll be much more enthusiastic to make a positive contribution when asked. So, I've covered a lot, lots of options here, lots of things for you to think about how to plan in advance, how to minimize or avoid the mistakes, and how to optimize and up-level your approaches to change. My pro tip for you today is how to avoid and mitigate the 10 common mistakes. In part 1 of this topic, I recommended using the mistakes as an assessment with leaders so they can see for themselves what's happening and the cost of it. If you've done this, have your leaders select the top 3 that are most costly to them. Ensure they understand them and recognize the cost they produce. Look carefully at the underlying causes of their priority mistakes and engage them in how to prevent these mistakes in the future. This will potentially alter their approach and your approach for leading change. It's a great opportunity, this exercise, to up-level your organization's change leadership capability. Now, my personal reflection for you, now that you see these patterns, you cannot not see them. Get in front of them before they repeat. Consider your strategy to do so. Do you yourself understand them enough to discuss them and their costs to the organization? Do you see the part your role and how you are positioned on the project may be one of the factors enabling these mistakes to occur? Is there something you could do differently to be positioned differently? Consider what steps you can take before the next project, potentially as a part of an after-action review, to raise them to leaders' conscious awareness. Think about what you can do to take the right actions instead of these particular things. This gives you a lot of ammunition to raise questions in a proactive and supportive way, not confronting, not creating defensiveness, but actually contributing to the up-leveling of the approach to change that you currently take. I hope you've received some value from today. It was a chock-full episode, and I appreciate you spending some time with me. Today's subject is one of the key topics that we feature in our Leading Transformational Change online program. If you'd like to learn more about leading transformational change, go to beingfirst.com/LTC. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope you gained some valuable insights for your work. Please send me your questions and challenges by going to askdrchange.com.